Okay, we're live. Yay. My name is Emily Clay. I'm with Illume Hire, and I am the co-founder, and we're building out a career community for seasoned professionals. In February, we are launching a course called Getting Unstuck, where we talk with Ken Marshall, who is the CEO of a digital ad agency called Doorbell. And it's really about the process of clearing our minds in order to move forward and get unstuck. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. If you want to participate in that workshop, just go to our newsletter area so that you can get an alert about that workshop. So today we have Adam Day, who is a freelance consultant and leadership coach for the Medici Group. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Emily.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about Adam's background. It is quite varied. So Adam has super diverse background. He was a journalist, he was an aid worker, a corporate strategist, he was a C-suite advisor, R&D executive, as well as a coach. And with all of these experiences, it's really enabled him in order to engage and do the work that he does with a really diverse disciplines, mindsets, and he's able to work with a bunch of different personalities and cultures. And then he's also worked for leading brands such as Nike and WeWork, and he's focused on team performance, diversity, equity, and inclusion, obviously, and how companies can really elevate their workplace experiences, whether it's integration of HR, design, or technology, or all three. Did I get that right?
That's great. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so currently Adam he's consulting with teams across many different sectors, giving him a view into the different challenges and trends affecting workforce in this very chaotic and unusual year. So today, just as a reminder, the agenda is transformation at work, and we're really focusing on three different areas. The first one is major work trends that are changing or accelerating as a result of COVID. Progress and new directions for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also new opportunities for the intergenerational workforce. We all know the demographics are changing, longevity is here to stay, which is a good thing. And so how is that going to affect work? So let's dive in.
Okay.
But as we kick this off, it's a really unusual time. So just the level of anxiety that I've been hearing about from other people and uncertainty, it's a nutty time, and I feel like a lot of people kind of have generalized anxiety all around. So Can you talk to me a little bit about what you're hearing from executives? How has this past year changed in terms of the future of work?
Yeah, we definitely have to start there. It's been historic on all fronts, and I think you're right, Emily. It's the future of work has been coming for many years, so to speak, and that process has been, 10 years have been accelerated into a few months. And I think, in addition to the COVID pandemic, the social justice movements, Black Lives Matter, and a lot of the disruptions, particularly in the United States, those two forces really have had a massive impact, not just on our society, but especially how we're thinking about the workforce. And I think on the pandemic side, what's been really interesting in terms of how that's affected work is that the shift really has been a normative shift. There hasn't really been any breakthroughs this year in terms of technology or policies. All the tools have been here. We've had them for years. We just haven't used them. And overnight, companies had to jump in and adopt to Zoom, to remote working, distributed teams, et cetera, and realized actually they could do that. And that set in motion trends that were percolating, but really were slow in the uptake. And likewise, on the social justice movements, I think with equal and different force, that also has been transformative in terms of forcing companies and brands to take more decisive positions on social issues, to elevate how they think about diversity, equity, inclusion, And I think it's changed how workers and employees are thinking about their relationship to work and to their employers, and employers' relation to society. And so I think these are huge shifts, that have been underway for a while, and now have, like you said, have been accelerated and amplified. And of course, this is on the back of a year of incredible hardship and loss. I think we do need to step back and look at the big picture in terms of these historic events and the long-term trends. I think we could get to a really positive place. And so I try to channel my excitement there, but it definitely has been a stressful time for many, for sure.
So I'm going to tag on to that. You talked about acceleration, but what about it is most exciting? Is it being able to kind of form the path forward, or can you dive into that a little bit more?
I think there's quite a few different trends and factors. I think the acceleration that is most energizing for me is around the ability to unlock kind of human potential, to actually bring more people into the workforce, to allow people to express themselves in new ways, to do more and better work. So again, I think the opportunity here is huge. There's just a lot of complexity we have to get through. And so I know you're interested in some of the high level trends and things that I've been following and have been in the news. And I thought we could go through a few of those.
Absolutely.
And would love to get questions from the audience too. I think the first one that comes to mind is around the effect of the pandemic, but all of these shifts on career development, both the beginning and end of careers. And probably some of you have seen a lot on the beginning side of an incredible disruption that is starting on the college piece, sort of as you're thinking about developing your career and getting into the workforce, people are rethinking college. There's a huge amount of students not even, deferring from this year. If anyone follows Scott Galloway, does a lot of he's the MIT professor, a lot of work on the disruption of the university business model. Another organization that's really exciting that we worked with at Nike, Global Citizen Academy, Abby Falik is their leader, has been looking at pushing for gap years and sort of reimagining how to develop the capabilities that employers will be looking for. You see things like Google both offering to potentially supplant universities by offering its own programs, but also not requiring degrees to get in. So you see a lot of changes in our assumptions around what you need to enter the workforce. And I think similarly, almost in a mirror image on the tail end of careers, there is a whole other set of disruptions, where you don't have just the typical decades of service and retirement. You have an end of career phase that is more exploratory, where you're jumping between different industries. You may be going back to school. You may be doing sabbaticals or other things where you have a similar flux and exploration and contribution in a way that you may be coming in and out of retirement. So I think it's really exciting to look at both ends of that career trajectory and what's happening.
No, that's awesome. I love it. It's so positive. Okay, so it was called what? Global Citizen, what was it?
Global Citizen Academy, that's the organization, or Global Citizen Year. They've done a lot of overseas programs to take high school students and have them take a gap year before going directly to college. Again, with the goal of giving them a lot more global perspectives. I mean, again, the theme of diversity, seeing firsthand how the planet is operating is really powerful for those kids. So I think that's a great program. Like I said, Scott's done a lot of great writing too, if you're interested in the changes afoot on the university side. So I think that's one area of work, and obviously it affects your focus in terms of older generations and their career trajectories. I think another big area, we talked about, the pandemic and remote work. Obviously, the dispersion of work, I think, has been set in motion and will continue in terms of where and how you're able to work, which is exciting and very empowering. And a lot of people are already looking at second-tier cities and vacating New York and SF and Seattle and realizing they can work anywhere. And that's, I think, good. But every trend also is sort of a tension, so there's also challenges with. That means increased competition. There may be, lower wages. There's other things that are happening in that space. But I think it does speak to a higher level of control around how employees are able to dictate the terms of how they're working, or contractors. It'd be very hard to kind of put the genie back in the bottle and say, you need to come back. I think there was something in the papers last week that a third of knowledge workers say they would quit if they had to go back to the office. I mean, this is during the recession, so you can imagine with a more robust economy, employers really are on their heels in terms of what they can ask people to do. And so I think that's a really positive trend on net, I think, for all workers, but I think especially for the segment you're looking at in terms of later in careers and maybe working more independently. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I've just been reading a lot about just the hybrid, opportunities, and that people are really careful about in-person meetings. Like really, it isn't just, sitting in a conference room. It's okay, we're going to be really deliberate, and here's an agenda. And do I really have to be here in person? I mean, come on. I mean,
that's the joke. I mean, people realize like how many things can be emails and not meetings. And I think that's a great segue, I guess, to another trend that I think, which is a cliche in terms of thinking about the death of the office, but I think it's really about the death and rebirth of the office. Having come from the real estate sector, it's fascinating because the assumption there is that, the office is a capacity problem. Like if you're growing a business and you're hiring people, you assume everyone needs a desk. You need to add square footage. And this is a cost center for your company. And I think as we've seen with the pandemic, overnight, enormous organizations are being run nearly virtually. And people are exactly questioning the purpose of the office. Like, what are we doing here? And I think the thinking is gravitating exactly as you said to say, well, actually, the purpose is not the capacity for desks to do individual work, it's actually to convene and to collaborate. And one story, I was at Nike for many years, and that jumped out that really showed me how powerful this was. Is we were doing a project for an Olympics team that we were supposed to be done during the Brazil Olympics. Last minute, we had to move about 150, 200 people as a media group back up to the Beaverton campus, and there wasn't any space. And so it was a very quick project where we had to house them in a partially renovated floor, cement, temporary tables. It was well below the Nike standards in terms of overbuilding. But we researched what happened with this team, and on the tail end of it, we had some of the highest marks we ever received for a workplace experience. And we were really confused because we spent almost no money on this, and it was last minute and everything else. And when we talked to the employees, again, sort of separating out the energy around working on the Olympics team, but to say, some of them would say, we'd rather be there forever. We don't want to go back to our old offices. This is the place we want. And we realized what they were really speaking to was the proximity of all of their colleagues were right there. There was a lot of energy. They could talk to people. It wasn't precious. They could make a mess. They could write on the wall. They can do different things. And so it had all these elements that often are missing in offices. And so I think what we're seeing is that the office, to the extent that it survives, it has to win you over. It has to be something that's worth going to.
Yeah.
I think, that will be a challenge to say, do I want to sit in my car for an hour to get to the office, and do that? So I think that it will be reborn. Like you said, it will be a core part of a lot of companies, but not the only thing, and it will be used in a very, very different way.
Yeah.
I think the co-working, I spent time at WeWork as well. And even though WeWork has had challenges as a company, the sector itself, I think, is poised to grow significantly, as more people, even if they're full-time, maybe a mix, of working at a headquarters as well as a co-working area. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, one reason I left my previous job was because I wasn't allowed to work from home at all. And then 7 months later, it's like, oh, how's that going? Just kind of interesting how it all plays out.
Yeah. Okay. And that's going to be, I think, again, it's empowering for employees, for leaders, and for organizations. It's adding a lot of layers of complexity, they have to do in terms of who's where and what's going on.
Well, and if you're an adult and you can complete your tasks and, exceed your goals and numbers and everything, then cool. If you want to work until 2 a.m, who cares, right? So the next one is about Black Lives Matter. It really shined a light on the lack of equality and equity. So I'm curious about, what are you hearing from leadership? How can people also,
Yeah.
when people are interviewing, how can they get a feel for their commitment to DE&I? Because I know that they're
Yeah.
held to higher standards now and measuring it closely. But as someone from the outside, how can you
Yeah.
really know
Mhm.
what if it's for real, if it's successful? Because I think more and more people can be, obviously really picky about where they
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, no, and I think they're leading with their values. They want to see it reflected in the organizations they're thinking about working for. I think, and to your point, now this is top of mind, and I think, and a lot of leaders are focused on it. They don't all know, I think, what the right thing is to do. And I first want to maybe talk about a couple kind of areas of concern and caution I have, as well as thinking about what are signs that an organization is on the right track. And I think the first is this. You'll see a lot where it's much easier to act externally than it is internally, I think.
Sure. Oh yeah, we've seen that. Yeah.
So you see a lot of organizations that are making, again, great gestures, donations, or being, or acting in different ways, and that can be fine, such as it is, but it raises the stakes in terms of what they're doing internally. So there's not a disconnect for employees to say, instead of doing this outreach, we need to really fix our own house first. And so you definitely see companies I'm thinking of that have been incredibly bold and forward thinking, like Ben and Jerry's social media campaign against white supremacy. There's been things that have been very forthright and direct and really on brand. I think they're inspiring. You probably saw in the news recently, Apple just announcing $100 million venture fund for underrepresented founders. So, and those are all great things. We want to make sure within those companies that similar level of efforts are focused internally. So I think that's the first piece, is to make sure you feel like there's a balance there. I think the next area of caution, which is around the belief that we can address this by having quick volunteer committees to think about it, to be doing a sprint of required, bias workshops or things like that. Again, not that that isn't the right theme, or those aren't things that should be considered, but oftentimes they're very superficial, and they don't actually have the systemic change that you're looking for. And so companies that fall into that trap, it seems like it's a productive response. You can check the box, but it actually doesn't really address the core issues. And I think the last piece that you need to look at is, I think leaders are trying to step into this space with really good intentions. And I think in some cases, it's really opening up space for conversations that are needed and long overdue. In other cases, I think leaders have not known how to do this and inadvertently create bigger problems by trying to step into the space. In situations, I hear stories where the leader might want to talk about these issues or the effect of the DC riots or aspects of social protests, and open up the meeting and then talk the entire meeting and no one else has spoken, and close the meeting, which has seemingly an opportunity for connection and strengthening, and then it's missed. So there's things there that I think are warning signs. But I think a lot of companies are the things to look for, that I would look for in terms of focusing on companies. First off, in terms of the where the power and money is, I guess, is to focus on incentives and alignment in terms of, is the leadership team or the chief executive, is their comp tied to diversity, recruitment, retention, promotions? Is there a straight line between how that's working, or is that disconnected?
But would you say that if there isn't any PR around that, like I say, it's not a public company, so if there's no press release around that, then assume that no, it's not tied?
That would be the exception. Yeah. So that would be unusual, so I think it shouldn't be. I think that should be more the norm, but I think that's something if you can find that information, to sort of say this should be just as important as any other performance metric in terms of motivating leadership. I think, just the transparency, like you said, for private companies might be more difficult, but publicizing, D&I targets, assessments, making sure that that's transparent. The simple, on the representational diversity, does the leadership team reflect the consumer base and employee base that they're overseeing? And I think that's surprisingly disconnected sometimes. I think the issue of pay equity is a really huge one. There's a really great startup on the West Coast here, Syndio, that's looking at algorithms that analyze pay equity. And I think that's something, looking for the company, are they regularly assessing and rectifying pay disparities, and that's, again, not necessarily the norm yet, but should be, because it's very difficult to get into authentic changes in your culture if you don't have diversity represented in leadership and you have massive pay disparities. Like if those things are still in play, it's really hard to kind of go beyond that. So I think those are big ones. I think when you think about looking at the D&I space, you want to look at how that's structured. Like, are there a lot of resources for this work, or is it more kind of employee volunteerism, which is fine, but it reflects sort of the values the company's bringing in terms of what it's spending money on. And even the leadership within HR and in diversity, do they have control of budgets? Are they part of the core operations, or is it a very senior position that actually is influence only and has no resources? So you'll see a lot of differences there that will tell you something around how they're thinking about this. And then just zooming down in terms of the day in the life of a company, you want to be looking for stories about leaders that actually are creating space for these conversations, and modeling it, and that there's an inclusive culture, that people can show up with their whole selves, that diversity is valued as an end in itself, as well as knowing that this is something that is a core part of how the company is going to be successful in the future. There's a lot to look at, and very few companies, I think, are able to get all those pieces right, at the pace and scale that they would like to. So.
Okay. No, really interesting. We do have one question that it popped up in the chat from Shannon. How do you recommend we assess internal values alignment of a company we're exploring as a job seeker? Not so easy to assess as values in external communications and behavior. So that, I would say it'd be, try to find somebody within the company, or, some within your network. And maybe, you can get information that way.
Yeah, that's obviously the best in terms of current employees or recent employees, and asking them, do they feel like there's a disconnect between the values, especially kind of the employer brand? Is there something different between what you're telling the market and what's actually happening internally? But I found that often is best through your networking and conversations with people. To the extent that it's a larger company and there's a lot more coverage and analysis on Glassdoor and otherwise, there may be ways to tease that out. But I think it's a great question and point, because it's something that I think any job seeker would want, and it's really hard to stay at a company where that's a disconnect, because you just don't feel good about the work you're doing. So.
Well, and I'm seeing a lot of blogs or things on Substack, or people are really being candid after they leave the company, saying, hey, this is what happened to me, and this was the pay equity issue I had, and over again. So people are less shy now, and some of those things go viral, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
If people think, oh, that's not really super important to us, well, yeah, it is.
Yeah, and that goes back, which is a great point, sort of the empowerment piece of the individual, and the the review, and to sort of say, I can make this public, and people can elevate that. So I think there is companies do have to, and I think it's also, I think another point to bring up related to that is the power of the transparency around data. Like, what is happening in terms of what people are paid, how organizations are functioning. And so in some of my work, we've been involved in sort of organizational analytics, looking at, not just payroll, but how people are collaborating together. And I think similar to that piece around the disconnected values, there are really positive and negative things at play, in terms of using information to monitor and discipline employees, in different ways, like when you're working or not, that can be misused. But also really positive things where I've seen companies, use their analysis of their own data to just to give a few examples. You can see that executives are emailing everyone late at night and over the weekends. Well, that leads to a lot of burnout, and then they can go in and they can work with people to kind of course correct. Or even more profoundly, there's been some studies where one thing that happens more in the DEI space is there's been, for example, a promotion of women and minorities, for example, across different leadership roles within a department. So you look at that and say, well, this might be positive depending on what the company's goals were for that function. But what they looked at was what happened with how the work happened, like who was going to what meeting, like what was it? And they realized actually that the power structure hadn't changed. Promotions happened, but decisions were being made elsewhere. And they can see that in the data. And so there's a level of transparency that's almost sort of at a MRI kind of resolution that can be used, I think, in really profound ways to improve the health of organizations. And I think as employees get more visibility to that can be powerful. And I think especially on the outside, if they can understand how well and how healthy a company is, that's great for everybody. But it's a exciting and crazy new world in that space.
Yeah, the transparency piece would be amazing. I would think it would be, just play well into much more engagement and trust, which is kind of big right now.
Yeah.
So can you talk to me a little bit about the intergenerational workforce? I mean, are you, it falls off of DEI, oftentimes age does specifically. So is age diversity really discussed in your line of work, in your circles and leadership, or not really? Is it mainly, so I've heard from, a couple of companies who said, look, we're focusing mainly on women and people of color.
I would say that that's the primary emphasis, I'd say. I'd say it's part of a lot of conversations in terms of overall talent planning and org design and looking at a increasingly multi-generational workforce. So I would say it's definitely on the table for discussion. And I think it's an important part of what we mean by how diversity can improve the importance, the performance of a company, in terms of if you have a disconnect or a disproportionate number of only younger employees, for example, you are missing a certain thing. Going back to David's book on range, thinking about Carol Dweck and the growth mindset. If you have a diverse cross section of people, because of their age, they're bringing a lot of different industries, a lot of different experiences. They're able to improve the performance of a company and how you think about it. I mean, I think even though I think overall there's fewer differences than you might say, there's a lot of cliches around sort of generational differences in the workplace. I think there's a lot of shared values there. You do maybe find younger teams throwing time at the problem, as opposed to trying to think more strategically around, are we solving the right one? So I'd say it's on the table, but definitely is not seen in the same way in terms of HR and representation. I do feel like it's critical as you think about how to tap into diverse thinking within teams. And especially, I think this is a point that connects with a change in where we're going to be working, like take away the desk, the corner office, et cetera. Opportunities for mentorship and menteeship are really important within organizations, and how you can organize those in this new work environment and connecting kind of generations, I think, is really important for organizations. A lot to cover there, but
no, I think it's encouraging. There was an independent research study that I found through this nonprofit organization, and it was by Clover Pop, and they talked about, look, if you have 20 to 25 years difference on your team, you are 73% more likely to exceed your business goals. Whereas if you are age uniform, that percentage drops down to 35%. And I thought, wow, that is so interesting.
No, it's great. I loved you brought that up. Yeah, we referenced the Medici side, the Clover Pop research as well, in terms of looking at exactly as you said, sort of the role of gender diversity, age, et cetera, and how that affects, team performance. And that's why, again, it's both the discussion around values and priorities, like in terms of making sure the diversity is there, but also it's a critical aspect of how teams function. And especially, again, not to belabor the point, but every organization is going through this incredible transformation about their business model, their strategy, how they're structured. And so they need their employees and these teams to be thinking as creatively as possible around what's next, and I think it's a liability, to have to be missing that now.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I also talked to somebody who said he was a professor, and he was talking about how there is going to be a labor shortage. Not now, of course, because the pandemic had slowed down, but in 4 or 5 years. And so those companies that get on board early, are going to benefit in terms of hiring people of all ages. So we usually answer questions at the end, but we've got another one here. Helen is asking, with all the emphasis on social justice issues, why do you think that diversity and inclusion rarely addresses age? Age intersects with every ism out there, and yet it tends to be ignored. Right to the heart of it.
That's a good, I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of biases, that we're trying to unpack, and I think, like Helen's talking about here, there is, and I mentioned the book kind of late bloomers, there is a bias in the workspace, again, an ageism effect, that there's a focus on sort of youth, in terms of what people are looking for talent, or assuming where the good ideas are going to come from, et cetera. So I think that is something that we're trying to correct kind of in the culture. I think in terms of where it's not represented, to your question, Helen, around the D&I piece, part may be that, there is such disconnects in terms of the lack of representational diversity in so many areas that are simply missing. That seems like more of a priority than companies that have more of an age distribution within their workforce, even if they are not accessing the talent correctly or tapping into them the right way, or there are aspects in terms of discrimination or bias against them in different ways. It has, I think you're right, perhaps less visibility than other issues within the D&I space that seem more urgent. But I think it's a correct assessment to say this really is a through line, in the organization in terms of how to support and counteract some of those biases. So I'll agree with you, but not totally have the answer for you on that one.
Yeah, no, I feel like there's a lot more discussion around it. I just don't know from leadership, at larger companies, if that is a discussion point, if anybody's concerned about it or looking out for it. So that was great. In terms of, so we already talked about remote work and the advantages. Can you talk to me about the leadership attributes as a result of the pandemic that are going to be key, beyond empathy, because that's been talked a lot. Yeah. It's been talked about a lot, and that's great. I like empathy a lot, but what else?
Yeah, I'm pro empathy. I think that's a good thing.
I'm pro too, but I want some new stuff.
I think, a few pieces stand out. I mean, obviously, to the extent that, remote is here to stay, or it's part of the mix, and it's hybrid in terms of the workforce. If that's the case, then I think one ramification of that is around the management of teams. I think a lot of organizations, it's been very much, on-site work, and everyone is present for their staff meeting, et cetera. I think when we get into this hybrid model, it's going to be every interactions and things are going to be a mix of virtual, and people are in the office and someone's headquarters, co-working, et cetera. I think for managers that have a more hierarchical or presenteeism approach, so to speak, I want everyone around me working, that are used to doing a lot of kind of hallway managing up. You catch the executives in the cafeteria. You want to make sure everyone's typing at their desk when you're in your corner office. If that's sort of how you are leading, which not that necessarily it's a bad leader per se, but it is it's not a very resilient method, because if any of the pieces are missing, you're basically blind to what's happening because you're really relying on that constant presence. And so I think with this new model, we really need to have leaders that are going to be able to, learn how to trust, to motivate, to manage distributed teams. You may have people on your team that you have never met in person. You may have people, different time zones, and it takes a lot more than empathy, in terms of understanding, how do I build rapport? How do I hold people accountable in this new fluid way of working, which again, lots of benefits. A lot of people individually are enjoying it and are doing better work. But for leaders, I think it's raising the bar. And the reason I say that is I think the pandemic will be a sorting of good and bad management, as I think companies realize managers that are not up for that challenge are struggling and will continue to struggle. Their teams will leave the organization, as the saying says, you come for the brand and you leave because of your manager, that is going to be, again, accelerated further if they don't shore that up. So I would sort of focus on the ability to kind of inspire and manage remote teams, I think is a huge one. I think another one which is really core to what we focus on at the Medici group, is around thinking about intersections, and I think we were talking before we kicked off, Emily, on sort of just, trends in career and, being generalists versus having, specialized focus. And from what I see, I work with a lot of leadership teams across all industries, and I'm always fascinated by the complexity and the level of silos, the number of silos in organizations, in terms of how specialized the system needs to be, the organization needs to be, but then how difficult it is to translate and connect and, evolve how they're working because everyone's there. And so I think to the extent that people have both, some sort of the T-shaped piece, but they have some of their core competencies, but they're really good at this intersectional thinking and networking, so that you might be in marketing, but people in supply chain, people in finance, you can speak their language, you can work with them, you can be an advisor to them to help them think differently about their challenges. You're comfortable in a space that's not your core competency. And I think companies are really looking for that. And it's not to say that you're trying to step in and do another function's work, but that other function needs you to be able to hear their challenges and help them with them, So I think that's that idea of sort of intersections is really important and to encourage something for people to focus on. And then I think the last one, I'm kind of a contrarian by nature, but I think it's important increasingly with companies, because within an organization, within a team, the group think trend is inevitable. Like, people, you just sort of go with the flow. We're all social organisms. We want to agree with each other. We want to kind of be on the same page. And so that's fine. But again, going back to companies that really are trying to reinvent themselves, they have incredible financial pressures, growth pressures. They're looking for people that can challenge assumptions and to push them and to try to be thinking differently and be resilient with those changes. And I think it's an important skill, but it's a nuanced one, which is to be 100% on board with the company and the team, but also be able to push back and to ask questions and to try different things and do so in a way that is respectful and it's not off-putting. And so to try to, like, how do you challenge, but also do that in a really inclusive way? And I think people that can really find that sweet spot, because you don't want to be with someone who has the best idea and is really disrespectful for the rest of the group. And I think that companies need that. They're looking for employees that have that skill set.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's difficult to find. I think sometimes, there'll be a leader who everyone will look to for their answer and then race to agree with them,
Hmm.
instead of countering. And then if you do counter, then sometimes, it just has to be
Well,
a
and
safe, a place where that leader is okay with it, and they encourage people to push back or ask, just not even push back, but just asking questions around why did we decide to do that, or can you explain, because we tried that here and it didn't really work. Do you mind if I explain why? They have to be open to those ideas in order to innovate, right?
yeah, and I think again that's important nuance on the skills, which is you need leaders to be receptive to those questions, to those challenges. They want to be
Mm-hmm.
curious. They have to create a safe space, like you said. It has to be an inclusive environment so that if there are questions or critiques, people can see that they're not punished for them. Like, and so
Yeah.
that's a really important piece. You have to honor that to say, but also employees need to be really good at how do you raise concerns and questions in a way that is as well received as possible too.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so I think how you phrase questions, for example, as simple as, what might be the benefits if we do this versus this, as opposed to why did you make that decision? That gives you a very different tone as a leader to say,
Sure.
oh, well, I thought I was doing that, so I think there's a lot to learn in that space.
Sure. Not being blunt. That's good. No,
Right.
I mean, I think it can be touchy when you're in a group situation and you have a different idea than leadership. It can be potentially. So I think that's good to kind of
Yeah.
note the communication tactic.
Yep.
So then, can you give me your take on the importance of DQ, or digital intelligence, and
Mhm.
EQ, emotional intelligence, in the workplace?
Sure. I mean, we were talking just a little bit now on the sort of example, I guess you could say, of EQ, in terms of how you manage a difficult conversation within a team. I think to the extent I know on the DQ side, aside from a lot, if you're in roles that are highly technical, obviously you have to have a command of the software and what you're working on in terms of those technologies. I think for so many roles, the software platforms and the technology we're using are shifting constantly. And so having obviously a minimum level of literacy is core, but whether or not for many people, there's rapidly diminishing returns in terms of trying to become an expert in some of the tools if there are people that already are kind of in that space. I think I feel like the deficiencies around EQ often can cause bigger challenges as an organization.
Mm,
In terms of just thinking about how you give feedback to others, how you influence people to try to drive an initiative, et cetera. Even something as simple as having an understanding of when something should be a meeting versus a phone call versus an email. And it's amazing the level of how much time organizations spend dealing with miscommunication and misunderstandings where people just haven't brought the right level of EQ to the situation. And a very small incident has become a very big one that's burning up a lot. So I guess I would be leaning towards, wanting to have really strong EQ and, the adequate DQ, so to speak, for a lot of roles.
yeah, and I put the DQ in there because that is one of the biggest myths or stereotypes of people over 50, is that, oh, they don't know anything about digital, or they're not tech savvy. And so
Mhm.
that's why I thought, well, have you been hearing that? Is that something that you hear in leadership teams of, oh, well, we can't hire
I
that person because.
I not directly. I haven't been
Mm,
in those type of hiring decisions in terms of an assumption around someone.
mhm.
So again, going back to the ageism piece, I can imagine that may be at play, unfortunately, in some
Yeah.
situations. That and sort of probably more efforts made to counter that impression, because I don't think it's a true one, but it's definitely uh, an unfortunate part of that dynamic for sure.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was curious. And then There's another question in here that is more interesting than my next one.
Mm.
So it's from Ben. It says, can you give a real life example of some of these modern teams that embrace inclusive pushback? I mean, and maybe you can't name companies because you're contracting with them, but maybe just an example of how that worked, maybe.
Sure, I'll give you an example of sort of an exercise we do sometimes with teams, and I think it's a fun practice. And Ben, hopefully this answers your question around what it looks like to generate, as you said here, inclusive pushback or criticism. One thing that I think can work really well is doing pre-mortems around projects or teams. Emily, have you done those? You know what I'm talking about with a pre-mortem?
I know what you're talking about, but it's been a long time since I've done one. I think it was a publishing company in San Francisco. Yeah.
Okay. I try to have fun with it too, because I think you want to try to balance sort of a tough conversation with bringing a lot of creativity, I think, and levity to it. And so, there's been a number of teams. I'm thinking recently in the healthcare sector that have been working with this tool. And I think it works pretty well. And the way you want to structure it is to take a project or initiative where you are convinced everything is on track and going well. So the team says, this is great, but there's probably some dissent there. There's probably some concerns that haven't been voiced. Like, not everything is perfect. And so you're trying to figure out, how do we surface this in a way that, like you said, is inclusive? And the way we do the pre-mortems is to think about, a kind of like a Hollywood disaster movie. So you're trying to think, and you flip it around to say, imagine everything goes wrong with this project. So it's the opposite of what we think is that. We're just like, the whole thing goes off the rails. We're going to split up into groups, and we're going to do a movie pitch explaining in as much detail as possible why the project fails. And by having groups have these discussions and then sharing out their impressions, they're able to create a safe space to talk about the truths that they haven't shared publicly about with the project. And oftentimes, when you look at the scripts of those disaster movies, it's basically all the things that are very likely to happen that the team has not talked about. And then that becomes a to-do list to say, oh, well, actually, funny we mentioned that, this was delayed. We probably should spend more resources or think about this more. So I think it's really finding the right, ways to create small safe spaces, to bring diverse groups together to think about the problem and allow them to share out their thinking in a way that I think can provide more visibility to it and safety, because I think the psychological safety is something we focus a lot on, and it often can be missing. And so that's just, kind of a one example. I think there's a lot of different techniques in this space, and it's something that leaders should really be focused on, because when everyone thinks everything is fine and going, or, there's always something, and it's really healthy to be able to say, hey, this isn't about an individual criticism. It's around our group trying to do our best work and to put out fires as soon as we can.
Yeah.
So hopefully, Ben, that give you a sense of maybe one way to go after that.
Yeah, I thought that was great. So I want to have enough time for questions, but I did want to ask you just about, your thoughts about no code and the passion economy. I know we've talked about it in the past a little bit, but can you speak to that a little bit about, just what do you feel about that in terms of potential and the future of work?
Well, I think there's, in terms of kind of empowering freelancers in terms of what they're, I think there's one thing I neglected to mention that I think is an interesting generational connection point is around the focus on sort of passion and purpose, I guess, in work, which I think is interestingly strongest at either end of the career spectrum, like at the beginning and end in terms of people really. And so I think that's an area of commonality. I think there is, like you're saying, there's never been better tools and support for launching, initiatives that people have, and I think that's lowered the barriers in terms of administrative things. Like, you can get things going overnight. I mean, it's incredible. And so I think there's enormous upside to that, but also in a similar way, that's increased the level of competition. It's hard to get visibility, and so similar to kind of what's happened with musicians in the music industry, I think it's can be both more empowering and increase your access, but also I think harder in some ways to break in, depending on what sector you're in. And I think it's going to be a combination of new and old, in terms of that, still the idea of, it's sort of the saying of, who gets the job, and, what and what you perform, how you perform kind of gets the promotion piece. To say there's an element of probably more, traditional networking in terms of being able to build your business through people that are coming from a lot of diverse disciplines, in addition to just tapping into some of the communities and using the technologies that you're talking about.
Okay. No, thanks. I think that's great. And for people who don't know, the passion economy is really just taking some of these tech tools, as Adam mentioned, and you're able to create something, super quickly without having a developer involved. So are there, another question from Karen, any tips on how to find the companies who don't look at age as a negative in the hiring? In the hiring process, as someone who is 50 plus, I always feel as if I'm being judged right away. Thanks, and hi from Toronto, by the way.
That's a tough question. So it's getting at, how do you know they're going to sort of see you for who you are, like not have that.
Those companies that are going to be empathetic, and and not only empathetic, that are intentional about hiring people who are age 50 plus. I mean, are there any tips that you would provide? Those lists do exist, and I can share those. But if anyone wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'd be happy to share the list of companies. But in terms of tips and how would you go after it, do you have any advice?
Obviously, I think the resource you mentioned probably would be a starting place. I think the only piece that goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, in terms of companies that don't really have a disconnect between the values they project in the marketplace and how they hire and manage their teams. And so, to the extent that you can get information and companies can emphasize that this is an area that they value, or an area of concern, or they've been working on, et cetera, that obviously is a good indication that they're taking this seriously, and they may see older candidates in different ways. So that's just something. Some companies are more focused on projecting their employer brands than others, but I think that would be something to look at. And it sounds like Emily just mentioned there's some resources where people have been analyzing companies probably across other metrics in terms of retention and promotion and other pieces, where I'm sure that could give you some insights. Again, going back to the data theme, where it's not about what they talk about. It's like, how have they acted, and is there evidence that they're bringing in older employees, in their careers and developing them, and I think there are probably some resources out there to analyze that. But I think it's a great thing to be looking for, because it sounds like that bias and that challenge is unfortunately far more common than it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody else has a question, please go to the Ask a Question button down below, and while we have Adam here. And then in the meantime, though, I wanted to, you talked a little bit about, is it Franz Johansson?
Franz Johansson, yep, he's the CEO of Medici Group.
And he's written a couple of books. So we have a whole takeaway document that that Nick is going to. Oh, there it is. He's so good. So anyway, he's got a PDF, but it also has 5 key takeaways that Adam talked about. So not only books for future of work and diversity, equity, and inclusion that he recommends, and intergenerational workforce, but also trends for independent contractors, and also areas that you can go to where companies are focusing on DEI. And then Adam talks about, he has a whole list of people that he would recommend following. One of those was Scott Galloway, which was not on that list, but Scott Galloway is a professor at NYU, and he focuses mainly on marketing, but he's brilliant. At any rate, and then also what really matters in the DEI space. And so, and then you wrote, 5 takeaways, which I really appreciate. So anyways, grab that if you guys might, check that out if you think it's helpful. Yep. And are there any other questions? I don't see any other questions. We're almost at 6. We're almost at 6 o'clock. I haven't even had any wine. Look, I'm having water. But anyway, I wanted to thank you so much for being here, Adam. It was super interesting. I loved it. Yeah. I didn't know that there was so much information on this, really. Especially sorry?
Oh, it was a fun conversation. There's days worth of material here, so it's hopefully it was useful for the audience in terms of some of the themes we touched on. I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just for everybody else, wanted to let you know that we have another event on February 18th with April Rennie. She's a TEDx speaker and author and actually knows Adam, which is kind of funny. They both went to grad school together. And she's going to be talking about how to create your portfolio career in the future of work. So if you want to, why don't you attend? So if you go to our events tab on our website, then you can register there, and we'll see you next month. So thank you again, Adam, for your time. I really appreciate it. It was awesome.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great week.
Yeah, you too. Bye.